So, this final chapter that we want to take a look at this year is World War II. And in discussing World War II, we're wrapping up the year here with a topic that many of you are at least loosely familiar with. I know a number of you have either read books about relating to this topic in your English classes, or it might be something you were just naturally intrigued by with various different movies or any other outlets that you may have already been familiar with. Now, the thing to keep in mind is this, and what we're going to take a look at here early on here, at the early part of this week, is the series of events that ultimately lead us into World War II. And you have to also understand, in order to understand what happened here, it was important to give you a little bit of background on how they got here. So, for example, a couple of chapters back when we finished up World War I, and we talked about when World War I was over, the Treaty of Versailles intentionally punished Germany for World War I. And we talked about how the Treaty of Versailles intentionally took away German territories, forced the Germans to pay everybody's war debts. And we talked about how unfair that treaty was at crippling the German government moving forward. We also took a look at the Roaring Twenties and the events that through the Roaring Twenties had ultimately the United States, after World War I was over, we had a decision to make. We could have either rebuilt Europe, spent a lot of American money trying to rebuild Europe to create good trade partners, or we could build the Roaring Twenties by taking advantage of a weak European continent. And we chose the latter. And we talked about how things like Yankee imperialism forced the European countries to become dependent on the United States. In last chapter, we talked about how, in the last couple chapters, we talked about the Great Depression. And all of those actions of the Roaring Twenties lead us into the Great Depression, but the problem is the Depression becomes global because of Yankee imperialism and a lot of that stuff. The point I'm getting to is this. When the Great Depression took place in the 1930s, it wasn't just an American problem, it was a global problem. And countries responded to that global problem in their own unique ways, turning to leaders that they typically wouldn't have turned to. Take, for instance, the United States. Last chapter, we talked about Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. And the fact is, while we today celebrate Franklin Roosevelt, he was a very controversial figure that not everybody loved at the time. Keep in mind, we're talking about the only man in American history to serve more than 2 terms as president. He served 3 full terms, was elected to a 4th term before he passed away. The New Deal, while we lauded all of the creative ways that Franklin Roosevelt and his brain trust created these new programs to get the American people through the Depression last chapter, keep in mind there were a number of critics who said these programs more closely resemble communism. Remember, we talked last chapter at what type of a government sets the wages for workers? What type of a government tells companies how long people can work? What type of a government sets the prices for various different markets? What type of a government does a number of those types of things? And the answer was usually socialist type governments. And a lot of people weren't comfortable with those New Deal programs. And when we finished last chapter, we talked about how when many of those programs were struck down, FDR actually went after the Supreme Court and tried to change the Supreme Court to give himself more power. And by the time World War II came around, that move of attacking the Supreme Court, FDR had lost a significant amount of support and probably wouldn't have become president for a 3rd and 4th term if it weren't for the problems that were brewing over in Europe and Americans being afraid of those problems. My point is this. Franklin Roosevelt, many people might argue, is perhaps the closest this country's ever come to a dictator. And it happened during the Great Depression. And why did it happen? Because Roosevelt was a strong leader at a time when the American people were vulnerable. So my point here is that it's very unfair for Americans today, in retrospect, with hindsight being 20/20, to say that Germans were terrible. The Germans were evil. The Germans allowed this evil person to do evil things, and Germany is so much worse than America, when at the time the American people were very vulnerable and did very questionable things ourselves. So what we want to look at today is we want to start taking a look at how does a leader like this emerge? How does somebody like Adolf Hitler, how does he become enabled to do these things? Well, the first thing we want to take a look at is the background of Adolf Hitler. Where did he come from? Who is he? And how did he emerge in Germany? Well, first of all, Hitler was not naturally German-born by birth. Hitler was actually raised in Austria. Now, the difference between Austria and Germany is relatively minute. The countries share same customs, cultures, religion, languages, all that stuff. But it is distinguishable, the fact that he grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not the unified German nation as we know it. Hitler became a German citizen because of World War I. When the war first broke out, Hitler attempted to join the Austrian army, but he was diagnosed with scoliosis. And as a result, the Austrian army rejected him. And Adolf Hitler was very bitter over this situation, but as the war grew on and Germany took on more and more casualties, the German army became a little bit more desperate to try to get bodies to fill the army as the war went. And Hitler was able to move to Germany, declare German citizenship, and join the German army during World War I. And so it's because of World War I that Hitler became a German citizen. He's not famous. He's not noteworthy during World War I. He's not a general. He doesn't have a military education. He doesn't have any high rank. In fact, he was a lowly corporal in the German army. He was somebody who was in the front lines, in the trenches during World War I. In fact, at the end of World War I, he finds out about the Treaty of Versailles from a hospital bed while he's recovering from a severe bout of mustard gas poisoning. Adolf Hitler is not somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, who grew up as a prominent American in a wealthy family and was on his way to becoming a leader. Adolf Hitler was a nobody. He was somebody that was from a poor town in Austria who had moved to Germany to become a German citizen during World War I, and nobody knew who he was. In fact, Adolf Hitler had really no interest in politics early on. His real aspiration in life was to be an artist. And he was a very good artist. I don't know about you, but the picture on the right there is an actual painting that Adolf Hitler painted. Now, I don't know much about art, and there may be all sorts of flaws with that, but personally, I know I can't do that. And I would say that Adolf Hitler was probably a very decent artist, and his aspirations were to be an artist for a living. But he applied on 2 separate occasions to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and he was rejected on both of those occasions. Now, to put that into perspective for you, we're talking about, at the time, the world's foremost art institute. So to be rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts was not a huge slight. It's just to say that he was not one of the world's elite artists. So, when the Depression hit in Germany, Adolf Hitler is like the average German. Adolf Hitler is somebody who comes from a small town, had these aspirations. He had fought in World War I, had been badly wounded, had suffered mustard gas poisoning, had recovered, returns home to a destroyed country. And the situation is worse in Germany than it was here in America. The Treaty of Versailles had destroyed them. Their country had been split apart. They had lost many territories that traditionally had been Germanic. And the people were desperate for a strong leader. Much like the people here in America were desperate for a strong leader like FDR. Now, it's during this period of time that Hitler becomes involved in the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party takes on a more predominant role in Germany as a result of the Depression. It's important to remember that at no point in time was the Nazi Party ever the predominant majority party in Germany. Unfortunately, unlike here in the United States where we only have 2 political parties, there were over 30 political parties in Germany. And so when you have that many parties, it's possible for minority parties to influence a lot of government policy. And so you have to keep in mind, at no point in time did the Nazi Party ever employ more than 35 or 40% of the German people. Most Germans were not Nazis. But the Nazi solution to their problems during the Great Depression was more government involvement. In fact, the word Nazi stands for the national, is the German word. It was for the Deutsche National Party. the German National Socialist Party. And so, once again, keeping this in mind, they were a National Socialist Workers' Party. What did we say was one of the huge criticisms of FDR and the Democrats during this period of time? Their solutions resembled socialism. So the point is, a lot of these ideas that were being spread in Germany as well as here in the United States were not typical ideas, but they were responses to a atypical problem that they were all experiencing. And when Hitler first came to prominence, you have to take a look at what his goals were. His goals were not world domination. His goals were not to exterminate a whole race of people. His goal was to reunite German territories that had been lost during the war. After World War I, territories that had always been considered German were broken apart and split up to punish Germany. And Hitler's answer was, let's reunify Germany. It wouldn't be that much different than to say that if the United States had lost a war and after the war was over, we were forced to give up parts of the United States like California, for example. Some of you may or may not like the state of California, but it's a significant portion of the American economy, and if it were removed from the United States and made its own country, the United States economy would struggle mightily. And if you had a president whose first order of business was to reunite the country and get people from other parts of other countries who consider themselves still to be the American citizens, we wouldn't think that was crazy. So when Hitler was proposing taking territories in Rhineland, along the Rhine River, and parts of Poland, and parts of Czechoslovakia, parts of other countries where people had grown up as German citizens, where people spoke German, and people considered themselves to be Germans. When Hitler said, we're going to reunite these territories, that was not considered crazy at the time. And Hitler's answer is that foreigners who had come into Germany and influenced the government policies and had influenced a lot of these government policies that had weakened the people of Germany and caused them to lose their jobs and to lose their homes and to be in this economic depression. He said these were un-German, unpatriotic people that had weakened the country. Hitler wasn't specifically pointing only to Jews. He was talking to anybody who had moved to Germany, who was viewed as an outsider. The idea was they were going to rebuild German power, which gets us to the term the Third Reich. Hitler was a historian. And so when he mentions something like building a massive reign, a Third Reich in Germany, what he's saying is we're going to celebrate being German. He says we're going to build, if you look back through Germany's history, we were the Germanic tribes that took down the Roman Empire. The second great reign in German history was when they unified in the late 1800s and they won the Franco-Prussian War. And in World War I, they should have won that war. They were the most powerful country on earth, and they should have won that war too. And Hitler said they were going to rebuild Germany stronger than it had ever been before. Once again, keep in mind, these are not crazy ideas. This is very akin to a politician today saying, God bless America. This is very akin today to politicians trying to get you to feel patriotic and to vote for them and to make America great again and all that kind of stuff that you hear people talk about. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is Hitler's message in that perspective is not that much different than the perspectives that you hear from a lot of politicians in a lot of parts of the world. Now, as Hitler consolidated power, he eventually is going to get out of control. My point today is, initially, his plans did not seem that out of control.